Good morning, everyone. Well, I can see a few good mornings coming in already. What a very warm welcome to you on this overcast day in sunny Queensland. Today we are fortunate enough to be joined by our presenter here today, Richard Litchfield from HPE Aruba, who has kindly offered to share with us today Aruba's progression in the market with how they're able to tackle data center automation and optimization. Richard is extremely well qualified to talk with us today on the topic, as he looks after the switching portfolio here for HPE Aruba. Before we get going with Richard today, I'll just go over the housekeeping matters. So everyone there on the call, look, we've got a chat tab open. If you've got any questions, look, as Richard's going through the content today, I'll keep an eye on the chat, and so will Andrew, who's our moderator for today's session. We'll also have some Q&A towards the end, so if there's any questions that come through that I'm not able to answer or that Richard doesn't preemptively answer on the way through, we'll also answer those. The session is being recorded, and you'll be emailed a link afterwards. So we'll also be providing a giveaway Aruba Enterprise Access Point at the conclusion of today's session. So the way that will work is that on the email out follow-up with the link, the winner of today's Enterprise Access Point will be notified via the email that comes out post today's session. Without any further ado, Richard, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, and I'll just bring up the screen share and I'll get started with my presentation. So I think you should all be able to see my slides now, and I might just turn off my camera as we go through because you don't really need to see me talking.
Right. I'll do the same thing there, Richard.
Very good. Hopefully it won't use up too much bandwidth just so we can get through the slides. I'm going to take you through automation and the way that we see that, particularly in the data center. I'm part of the HPE Aruba team. I'm one of the regional product managers, and I specifically look after all of the Aruba branded switching. So obviously switching is my main interest, but automation covers far more than just that. So we'll touch on all of that a little bit as we go through, but we'll kind of focus on the CX switches as the main part of that presentation. So next slide. Now, the key thing about automation, what are we going to cover exactly, what it is, why you should do it, and how you do it with Aruba products. So pretty straightforward. And what is automation? I think probably you've come across many different things that might describe in the way you think about automation. Certainly popular. It's something that has a lot of airtime associated with it. You may also have found it somewhat daunting, wanting to know how you should get started, what's actually required, how much you have to do. And certainly from the way that Aruba looks at that, we don't necessarily want or expect or require that you all do everything end-to-end fully automated. You can, and there are certainly some organizations that do that, but it's not a requirement. You don't have to do an all-or-nothing type approach, and of course that makes it a lot easier to slide more gracefully into that automation process for some things. So perhaps you might start with the access points, or you might start with switching, and then you might bring all of that together. You might then start to integrate some of the other parts of the data center as well. And I suppose that sort of concept about it being somewhat like magic, it's not. It is all very straightforward and well defined. It really is just a question of picking up at the beginning and working your way through it. And of course, we've been leading the way on that for a very long time. Automation really is at the heart of progress. It's difficult to scale without automation. I mean, that goes back all the way to Henry Ford and his Model T, and the factory production lines and so on. That's kind of the start of it, and perhaps what people think about when they consider automation. But it's more than that. It really is a society-wide type of progress that's been going on. And whilst you can see automation pretty much everywhere, it has been, at least in terms of things like shopping and so on, a relatively recent development. If we were to think about shopping 1995 style, pre-automation, credit cards had sort of really only just started to come in. People might have had shop cards and so on. It was a completely different process. If you wanted to go and buy your fashion apparel of choice, you would have to go through a multi-step process. And there were also quite a lot of things that would be, blockers to that. It was time-consuming, multiple steps, lots of friction points, issues with, where do you go to park, how do you get there on the weekend when all the weekend sports on, then having to make sure that you've got all of the the relevant store card, getting the right sizings and so on. You compare that to what we have today. So you're out there looking for your cartons of toilet paper, because that seems to be the 2020 thing of choice these days. You can do all of this online completely. Back in the 90s, maybe there were online ordering sort of stores, but there was certainly no online internet. The internet really only sort of kicked off in about 93, 94, and it was still, bulletin boards back in those days. Now you've got one click, eBay, Colesworth, whatever. Minimal effort, everything is sort of stored already. You just have to make the selection. You choose the thing you want to buy and it will turn up, the next day or the next week, depending where it's coming from. And this is global as well. You don't have to just be buying, you wouldn't be buying ice cream from overseas, of course, but you might be buying, computer parts or fashion or whatever. And of course, there are also a lot of other options around things like, which card are we paying from? Which delivery address is it actually going to? Is it going to the office or is it coming to home? Is it going as somebody's birthday present, so being redirected as something like that? And that kind of highlights the options that are available as part of one of these, menu-driven automation style options, and that's exactly the same sort of way that things work in the IT space. And I suppose we sort of cover this a couple of times as we go through this session. It's more than just being about the technical details. There is a whole additional workflow that comes into play. Obviously, with shopping, there are a bunch of elements around the FPOS, payment process. In IT, you've got things like change control and making sure that relevant tests and so on are passed before it gets accepted into full production. So, what's in it for you? Why should you be interested in automation? There's a couple of things here which are really important, and it often comes down to the cost, the ability to save money. There's a couple of different ways that's kind of relevant, but one of the more obvious ones that's often talked about is the ability to take resources away from that fighting fires and sort of, business as usual type of day-to-day operations, and giving them options to do other things, develop new projects, work on the, more advanced types of, how can we add value to the business? If you spend 80% of your time fighting fires and just doing the day-to-day things that, you could potentially automate. And certainly in some of the larger organizations, they have effectively automated all of that day-to-day operational stuff. You can save some real money and make resourcing available to do those more important, development type projects. The industry as a whole is moving that way. Networking, I think, has probably been a little bit slower to do that. Why that is probably open to conjecture, but I think it's probably fair to say that the majority of networking engineers have loved the CLI, perhaps still love the CLI. There has been a push in the server storage space that goes back, even to the end of last century, to automate things. In the networking world, that's taken a little bit longer to come to fruition, but it is certainly getting there now. And when you look at all of the products that we have, for example, they all have automation elements built into them. And from the point of view of the CX switches that I look after, it was designed into them from day one. That was one of the key design criteria that was built in from the word go.
Richard, just quickly, if you're just starting on this journey, considering you've sort of mentioned that maybe the networking space is a little bit lagging in some of the other areas of the IT space in relation to automation, how can you suggest methods or any areas to get started? Because there might not be the robust processes already in place to embrace the level of automation that's now on offer.
Yeah, definitely. We have a lot of resources that are available to assist with that sort of, where do you start? What do you do? I don't know how to begin. What can I do? Right at the end of the slide where I've got the list of resources, you'll see some of the things. Perhaps one of the most interesting one of those is our Airheads broadcasting channel. So for those of you that have been around for a little while, working with Aruba products, you'll know that Airheads is our online community. It's a very strong and vibrant community. We've got well over 100,000 members in that now, and that's one of the great sort of go-to places when you're looking for information. One of the offshoots of that is the Airheads broadcasting channel. So it's a YouTube channel, and that's now got hundreds of videos that cover everything from how do you set up an AP in the most basic sense to advanced automation workflow demonstrations using things like Ansible. So I'll talk a little bit about Ansible later on, but there are certainly some very useful and well-defined processes to do this. Once you start to sort of move down that pathway, and it doesn't have to be necessarily, going full hog into Ansible, you can start. I'll show you. We've got a couple of demos that I do as part of this, where I show you, what the APIs look like and how they are used in the tools that we already have. And of course, the great benefit is that you can then interact, or you can have other systems interacting with them as well. So,
thanks, Richard. So I'll keep an eye out for the broadcasting channel of Airheads and Ansible. Thank you so much.
Very good. On screen at the moment, I've got a traditional way of doing a networking task. So it's obviously a fairly substantial task. We're going to deploy a new building on a campus. But as you look through that list, you can see that there are multiple things, including multiple non-technical items in this flow. So things like, change control processes, user acceptance and operational acceptance testing. And so whilst they aren't specifically technical, they all still need to be incorporated into the process flow. And when you start looking at things like, for example, change control mechanisms, when you've got an API that allows you to integrate with something like ServiceNow, so, the trouble ticket, database management processes, when you've got things like our user experience insights, so the UXI, the CAPE sensor, you've got APIs that can interact with those as well. You can actually do a lot of this automatically. And if you've got the ability to go and do a deployment without having to call on, Sunday morning when you've got, a bunch of people doing, users that are coming on their weekend to do testing to make sure that Monday morning is going to be a successful start. If you can already automate all of that beforehand, and then they've only got to get one person in just to do that final sign off, that's going to make life a whole lot less painful and annoying for everybody involved. So how does it look like with automation? So exactly the same networking task there, putting this new campus network, the new building with the new network installed into that. And you can see we now have a lot less steps involved. There are a whole lot less points for human interaction on the day. It's repeatable, and that's kind of one of the key things about automation. It really needs to be, that rinse and repeat type of exercise. If you can take those same processes, that same flow, that same set of scripts, and redeploy them for the next building, or if you're doing a smaller task like just deploying a new switch or a new controller, if you can take those and reuse them, then that make sure that you have much more consistency. I mean, one of the greatest challenges in any IT endeavor is maintaining consistency, particularly if something spans a long period of time. So whether that's weeks or years, I think we've all been through that process where we've had, I'll just follow the process, and you've done it a few times, think, oh, I can remember it now. I'll just do it, without, going through the checklist. And then, a day or a week or a month later, something happens, and perhaps you haven't set up spanning tree, for example, properly. You've left some key thing off, but that problem does not become evident until there's another problem which highlights the first one. If you haven't followed that process properly, and of course, humans are not machines. They tend to take shortcuts. They tend to want to save time, and of course that might lead to those sorts of problems. Of course, there's still going to be physical on-site work required. You're still going to have to rack devices and plug cables in and whatnot. But if you can do that with your cabling contractors, or if you can do that with backpackers, maybe there's not too many of them around at the moment, but certainly there'll still be cabling guys out there that they're going to be in the building anyway doing the cabling. If they can also do that rack and stack and plug stuff in, and you can have your people back in the control room without having to go onto site, that can be a very useful way of minimising the resource and the resource costing.
Richard, before you move on, if you don't mind just ducking through to that previous slide potentially, I have just a query. What provides the confidence that you've moved from the let's call it the necessary change control process as part of service management best practices through to the confidence level now allowing more automation in the change management approval process?
It's a very interesting thing, and that sort of observation is one that sort of is central to the whole DevOps way of doing things. There will come a time, no doubt, when people move down the automation path, where you have to ask the question, at what point can we, do we require a human sign-off versus a, automated process sign-off? And often that comes just with the experience of having done it. So we've worked with a number of pretty significant financial services institutions, and they not only have very strict internal guidelines about how things need to be done, they also have legislative requirements about how things must be done and how they must be reported to be done. And so they have been through this sort of process, and although you might not say that they're in a complete DevOps sort of mentality, they have now got to the point where they've got automated change control logging and updates, so that once a task has been completed, and that task might be a whole building, or it might be just putting in a new switch or a new configuration onto a switch, that is automatically logged. There will be a test process which is automated as part of that process. So that, let's for example say that we've made a configuration change on a specific port because that's where the HVAC gets connected, or where the building monitoring system is plugged in. There will be specific tests that are carried out as part of that automated process to validate that the before and the after, or the outcome, matches the expected outcome. And I suppose it's probably also true to say that when you go through this process of automation, it doesn't mean that you don't do some work. There's still work to be done that might be changed from the actual typing in a CLI and then testing it to having predefined what you're going to do and putting in a test that's going to validate that the outcome is what you expect it to be. Now, for nearly all of the things that we do in IT, those things are fairly well defined. That's the whole point about computers. They're deterministic, and so should the outcomes be. and obviously, if you're working in an environment that is well managed and constrained, then you can make sure that the test results are predictable and achievable. So maybe a long-winded answer to that question.
No, I got you. I think it was a very good explanation, because there's as you've suggested, maturity in your own internal service management practices, and also a little bit of confidence there, knowing that there's an evidence-based logging procedure around not only the change control, but also the testing and validation process. So yeah, thanks for that explanation, Richard. Appreciate it.
No worries. So we've now developed this sort of overall process, and we've gone from having lots and lots of little steps which have multiple places for things to go wrong and human interaction, to a much more streamlined and consistent and repeatable process. And it's more than just sort of doing those individual technical steps. It's about that overall operational workflow, like we just talked about. So how do you actually do it? What's the key to all of this? And I guess the one thing is the API. If you remember that one thing, it's that application programming interface. That's the key to making everything work. When you look at the way that things were sort of done in the past, so back in the 90s, you had a legacy of mismatched, incompatible formats and protocols, maybe different frameworks, schemas. It was not always possible to get two different types of devices, or a network management platform and a device, to talk to each other. You often end up using the lowest common denominator, things like SNMP. Now, not that there's anything wrong with SNMP per se, but it's old. That was sort of started back in the 80s. And it's kind of interesting with our switches, for example. When we originally did that definition, I said before that we had the APIs built in. One of the original design decisions was to not include SNMP at all. Why would you want to include something that's getting on for 35, 40 years old? It's kind of, we've moved past that now. As it happens, there are a number of customers we've got out there that still use SNMP, and they were unhappy that it wasn't there. So, in fact, SNMP still is there, but in read-only mode. You can't actually make changes using SNMP. APIs is the way to do it, as sort of defined here. And if you look at that diagram there, you might consider that would be a CX switch talking to our NetEdit management platform, for example. And whilst you could still have an older traditional network management platform making requests of our CX switch with SNMP, and it will get a response, that management platform cannot make changes using SNMP. API is the only way to do that. And the whole point about the APIs are that they are well defined, and they are well recognized, and they are used across the industry. It's very much like having that cocktail bar menu. So I'll have a vodka martini, shaken not stirred, and it's kind of exactly the same thing when you're looking at a system API. You make that order via the API. You can make those configuration changes. So, shaken not stirred, 1, 2, or 3 olives. Are we having all of the uplink ports manually configured, and all of the downlink RJ45 ports configured as colorless ports with downloadable user roles? And that's the sort of options that you've got, making sure that you've always got a set of predefined rules and options to give you that consistency.
Mm. For those of us on the call, Richard, who may not have been through some of the other sessions in the series, can you just expand on the terminology used, colorless ports?
Yeah, sure. So colorless ports is probably one of my favorite things. They're called colorless ports because every single port is configured in exactly the same way. So the same configuration is applied to all of the ports, which kind of makes them all grey. The colorless so being grey, the colours. But as you plug in a different device, so if you plug in a printer or a camera or a PC or a laptop or a building management system device or some sort of IoT gadget, all of those devices have been learnt and appropriate profiles configured, which you can then download and apply to the switch port, so that the printer gets access to the print server and nothing else, and the cameras get access to the camera control system and maybe the update server. But when you plug in a laptop, it also checks, am I logging in as Andrew, or am I logging as Richard? So Andrew is an employee and he gets access to all of the employee functions. As Richard, I get access to the internet only, for example. And that's the point about the colorless ports. All the ports have that same configuration, and using things like downloadable user roles or locally configured user roles, if you want to go that way, then the configuration is consistent across every single port, and you are using a centralized control management process, so ClearPass in our case, to make the changes based on the device or the user that's using it.
Yeah, that's great. So effectively, the colorless ports also has the ability to drastically improve the security posture of your network as well, because you're profiling those devices the minute they're connected to the network and applying them the right role access to the network.
Absolutely. And so one of the sort of the good examples of that might be, in the past, you may have had to administratively shut down every network port that was not in use, so that if somebody came in and plugged in a laptop, the port was down, so you couldn't use it. In this case, you don't have to do that. You apply the same configuration to all of the ports, and if somebody comes in and plugs into an unused port, the process of identifying, are you a trusted user with a certificate on versus are you some random person that's plugged in a laptop like me? So you may have two different policies then. You might have a policy that says, right, I don't know who you are actually, so I'm going to present you with a captive portal. Or you might say, I don't actually care who you are, but I don't know what you are, so you have internet access and that's all. Or you might say, I don't know what you are, and you don't belong here, so you get nothing. You can configure those sort of different options depending on what your requirements are.
Great. Oh, thanks for that, Richard.
So the APIs, the REST or RESTful APIs were one of the most commonly used. So that's a set of rules that developers follow as they create APIs. One of the critical elements of that set of rules is that you have to be able to get access to resource data when you make a request at a specific URL, URI. And that's the process that we go through. So it looks just like HTTP. And it's very easy to test this on a browser, and I'll show you what that looks like now. So this is one of my CX switches. So I will log into this and I will show you. So all of this is built via an API actually. But the key part that I'm going to show you is the API, what it looks like. So this is what we call the Swagger interface. This is just something which very quickly makes visible what the API looks like and the sorts of things you can do with it. And you can see that every one of these has got gets, posts, puts, deletes, and so on. So these are the standard attributes that you have to make changes, look up information and make changes. I'm going to go and do some lookups with this, so LLDP. So that's will show us what we have in terms of neighbors connected to different ports. So I'm going through the process using HTTP, so just a regular browser, and let's try it out. Let's see what it's going to look like. So it's saying I need to put in an interface. It is required. I'm not quite sure what that might be, so let's get some self-help going here. Go over to the interface view, check what that's supposed to look like. And oh, look, here we go. We need to use that format, so that 1/1/whatever. So I will go back to my LLDP, I will put in 1/1/50 because I know that there is something at the end of that port. I know, having done this before, that I need to put in 2. That will give me some additional information that I would not otherwise have got. So when I press execute on that, that sends that request via the API, and I get all of this information back again. So I can see that the port it's connected to is 27. I can see the management IP of that device. I can see it's connected via 10 gig LR, so single mode. It's a CX6200, and so on and so on. What's kind of relevant to this particular example, though, is this is the request URL that was built as we went through that Swagger process. So I'm going to copy that and put that into a browser window and paste it, and you can see we get exactly that same information. So that just highlights the point, this is all using standard existing, protocols and mechanisms. But when you use that with a programmatic interface, obviously you're not typing things in at the browser, but that's the kind of transaction that's going on in the background. Now, just to also prove the point, if I paste that into a different browser, so you can see I've started up another browser here. If I paste that into another browser, I will get an error because we obviously haven't been through any sort of authentication process to establish that. So it's not sort of open slather out there. You do need to, organize tokens and get authenticated and so on. But that's a very quick sort of overview of what that looks like in the real world on our switches. And as I was saying, the actual process is not using a browser per se; it's using code, and it makes the request, it gets the response, and it can take actions based on that. So you can have all of those if-then statements, all those combinational statements. If I have this condition and a second condition and a third condition, then we need to do some particular thing, and that thing might be that you are shutting down a port, or you are deploying a whole new system. And that's the whole thing about automation. And from the Aruba point of view, we have lots of APIs in all of our systems. So all of our software products, so Aruba Central, in our controllers or gateways now we call them, so iOS 8 and 10, ClearPass. So I talked about ClearPass before as being the policy point where we can do things like downloadable user roles, and of course all of our hardware as well. We've got the older Aruba OS switches, so the ProCurve switches that you might recall. They have got APIs in them, but they are not quite as fully functional as the ones that we have in Aruba OS CX. As I said before, the whole point about the CX design was that the APIs were put in from the word go, and they you can't actually do anything in CX. You can't add a new function without it appearing in the API. That's quite a considerable, turnaround in direction from what we had with things like iOS and what most of our competitors have, where doing anything with an API requires that sort of additional set of programming things that needs to be done, and it might not be available from the time that new feature is available at the CLI. In our case, it is absolutely by design. And it now might actually be a nice time to have a bit more of a look into exactly what those, how those sorts of things can be programmatically accessed, what they look like. So if I go back to close down these things because we don't need these anymore. So this is that same switch, so a 6300, a CX 6300 switch, and we're going to look into analytics. And so specifically here, we are seeing the sorts of things that you can see with the network analytic engine. And so the network analytics engine is using APIs to collect information, to check what's going on, and maybe to perform specific tasks when an event occurs, for example. So this is the sort of the most basic, the default system resource monitoring system that is shipped by default with all of these. One of the nice things about CX is that you can upload pre-configured scripts and agents that other people have already written, or if you write them, you can post them and have other people access them as well. Now, looking at such a short time frame is probably not a whole lot of use, so let's move across to 10 days, 30 days, and now you can see those little mauve purple colored squares along the top of the graph there. They all represent when there was a change, a config checkpoint. So we click on that, we can see what the changes were. So you can see the green things that have been added in, the red things that have been taken out. So obviously changed a network VLAN port on a device there. Now, if I move that out, I'm actually looking for something in particular that I'm not seeing here, because this is obviously a fairly well-behaved network. If we go out to 90 days, here's one. So there's a yellow triangle indicating that there was an event of some sort, and as part of that event-driven process, an alert has been flagged, so high CPU utilization, and 3 different tasks were run automatically and collected information. And so it collected information that's kind of relevant here. You can see that the top CPU used using processes, and it's done that for other things like system utilization and COPS, so control plane protection. Sometimes there's interesting things to be seen in here if there are problems in an environment, or if you are being attacked. That's not the case here. So what I might actually do, rather than looking at something that doesn't have a whole lot of information available, I might bring up a different slide deck quickly and just show you the use of that in the real world. So this is my real world. These are the 2 CX8320 switches in the lab. I put them in just before Christmas. And so looking at the system resource monitor that we saw before, so 10 days is too short, 30 days is better, and you can see we're starting to get a couple of events occurring here, and you can see over here we've got a lot of events, and so this is where it starts to get more interesting. So we're now sort of zooming in specifically on that short period of time, and you look and see fairly obviously that there are some ramps there. Those sorts of things are generally not good to have. That may be an indicator of a memory leak or something along those lines. And we click now on one of those alerts, and it will have automatically collected and stored, so you can go back and get that historical view, the output from those different things that it was specifically looking at. So in this case here, we've got DHCP, SNMP, NTP highlighted in that red box that were sort of top users. And I've now sorted them over here, and DHCP, SNMP, there are obviously some things going on there that needs to be drilled into a little bit more detail. So it showed that there was something else that was going on. NTP and DHCP were both implicated. I'd seen some other slightly odd behavior on a client, which maybe indicated DHCP was a problem. And it turned out, in fact, that I hadn't read the manual and that DHCP was misconfigured. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to be doing because I'd done the wrong thing. And I may not have actually realized that because, don't read the manuals all the time, as I suspect many people don't. I actually went and removed that misconfigured DHCP. So you can see here the red indicating it has been taken out. And we now look at the very flat, exactly what you want to see, outcome of that change. Now, that's a real world example that I used. If I hadn't had that in place, I may not have realized that I had these ramps going on and there was actually a problem until perhaps too late. Maybe something else had actually stopped working. Having that really made it easy to sort out what was happening. So back to our original slide set. What other things have got APIs? Well, pretty much everything has. So ServiceNow we sort of talked about, GitHub, Slack. So things like Slack is often used as a alternative to email for automated messaging when something happens. So you can have your team set up on that. But using combinations of all of those things and our devices, you can build those modern automated workflows. So how can you do that? You've got three different elements or things that you can use, and you can use some or all of them together depending on what's going to work for you. So if we start initially with the Aruba products, so Central, ClearPath, the controllers, all of the switches, they all have APIs built into them. They are all available for use. And when you look at the on the right-hand side there, we've already had a bit of a drill down into the APIs on the CX switches and what that looks like from the Swagger interface point of view. I'm thinking I might just do a very quick look at the NetEdit, which is one of our network management platforms that is, API based exclusively. So here's one I've set up before. So if we go straight into the network view, this is the network that I'm sitting next to at home, because I guess like many of us, we're working from home. So my core switch, the 6300, and I've got a 6200 there. All of this information has been discovered and captured using basic network discovery things, and then additional information. So over here, for example, things, we've got a red mark here. Why have we got a red problem here? That's probably worth delving into. Consistency check. And so straight away, I've got information about where I've got mismatched VLANs, where I've got ports that perhaps have VLANs at one end but not on the other end, and that could be a potential problem. I've got information about the system itself. You can see where it started to match up and provide information about what things are connected where. You'll also note when you look in here that we have the CX switches that have full API, but we also have a 2930, and we've also got a router. So we've got a Comware device in there as well. So you can actually see different things. It's not just based on the CX APIs. As we zoom into it a little bit more, though, we can see where it's starting to build, additional information about routing, spanning tree, and that's all information that it's collecting using the API to pull in information about spanning tree health, about the system resource monitor. Have we got any problems with that? And sometimes if you do have an error that's showing up in those network analytics components, it will actually flag them over here, and that nice green N will turn red, indicating that there is another problem, and you can drill into that as well. So other elements that you can look at. So, the do-it-yourself sort of, where can you go with that? So we've already mentioned the Airheads broadcasting channel. This funny cat-looking octopusy thing is representative of GitHub. And so we have a huge set of resources over on GitHub, which is once you start getting into any of the programmatic types of processes, where you would go to get the right APIs, decode, sample code, and so on, to help you to develop your own interactions. And then third-party elements. So we have things like Ansible, and we've got very complete VRDs that have been built into Ansible playbooks. So if you were building a data center that had, a spine leaf architecture, or if you were building a data center that had a more traditional, tier 1, 2, 3 type architecture, we have VRDs that define best practice for building those. And we also have Ansible playbooks that have been constructed around exactly that set of processes and exactly that set of best practice settings, and using things like Ansible with a spreadsheet that you populate with the relevant names, IP addresses, and so on, you can actually build a data center or a pod using these tools. StackStorm is a more sort of recent introduction into the world of automation. It's very much based around events, alerts, so you can have StackStorm take specific actions when certain events come in. You're going to have it also polling devices as well, so that you've got sort of that two-prong method of keeping tabs on what the system is actually doing. And I suppose from our point of view, you might think of that as somewhat similar to NAE, but it's outside the switch rather than running on the switch itself. So there you have it. I've got a list of the key resources there. So the question that we were talking about before, you can work through those. I think the videos are an excellent place to start if you're sort of wondering, what can actually be done, how can it be done. That's probably an excellent place to at least get the feel for it, and then you can dig into places like the developer portal and GitHub to find those specific resources and that additional assistance to make that work for you. And of course, don't forget the Airheads community. This is where you've got the opportunity to ask questions. There is a specific developer subsection in that community board where you can ask things around, how do I make a particular API functional? What are the parameters that I need to use because it's not working for me? And there are some very capable outside people, as well as our own internal technical marketing engineers that look at those pages and just keep tabs on that also. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and that's it from me for now.
Wow, thank you, Richard. I don't know what to say. That was, if I was like anybody else on the call, that was captivating. I think you've just shared so much valuable information on the Aruba portfolio of the switching, and let me just say, I think actually I'll just put up, sorry, our slides there to finish off today. I just wanted to say I get the impression that we've just scratched the surface.
There's certainly a big topic area there, but I guess one of the things that makes it so enjoyable to work in this particular environment is that you don't have to do all or nothing. I know there are some competitors out there where you kind of have to make that complete forklift change, and once you go down a path, you're committed absolutely, and you can't vary from that. In our environments, whilst you can certainly automate everything and you can have a pure, HP Aruba environment end to end, we kind of recognize that you will almost certainly always be working in heterogeneous environments where you will have, other vendors doing other things, and that might be server storage, it might be, firewalls, it might be, a core network versus our network, it might be all manner of different things. But because of the way that we've made sure that we are interoperable and that we have that granularity and flexibility, you don't have to do everything, as that automation. You can ease into it. Yeah,
and I've got to say, from what you've presented today, apart from the fact that my mind is completely boggling with what's possible, I think Aruba's done, and yourself clearly you've done an absolutely fantastic job making it easy to get started with just the resources available via Airheads, GitHub. It's just phenomenal to get yourself started. So big raise up for that one. Thank you.
Very good. I hope everybody got something out of that.
All right, thank you, guys. Look, on our 45 minute, we're about 5 minutes over. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. If you're anything like me, I think that your questions will be running hot about an hour after this event, after your mind has had a little bit of a chance to go through some of the content that we've gone through today. Look, as I've said at the start, we'll email out the deck and the session post-event over the next few days, and accompanying that will be the winner of today's Aruba Enterprise Access Point. So once again, thank you very much. I appreciate all of you who's taken time out of your day to attend.
Thank you.